You're listening to Well Now, Slate's podcast on health and wellness. I'm Maya Feller.
And I'm Kavita Patel. Psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA seem to be showing up everywhere. I recently attended a wellness and longevity event where microdosing of psilocybin and other mood-altering substances were touted as, quote, the medicine we all need, end quote. Peer-reviewed studies show promising results in treating various mental health conditions such as depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, addiction, and end-of-life distress. But despite this great progress and great awareness, there has still been reluctance, especially from regulators, including most recently the Food and Drug Administration's Advisory Committee, which voted to recommend against approval of one of the first psychedelics that would be available in the market.
A key FDA advisory committee today rejected the use of a psychedelic drug to help patients struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, questioning the trials and its effectiveness. The FDA must now decide whether it will follow suit and reject the use of what's known as MDMA. Some patients and researchers had long hoped the government would approve it.
The manufacturer Lykos sought a recommendation for its drug, methamphetamine, otherwise known as MDMA, specifically for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. In what was considered a blow to many advocates and patients, it was actually compelling, Maya, to hear from so many veterans and other patients during the open comment period for this advisory committee meeting, where they were just begging and discussing the fact that for the first time, there was something that was actually possible that could get them through what felt like a very dark tunnel, especially for persons with post-traumatic stress disorder. While we're still waiting for the FDA to make a final decision, it seems very unlikely that the FDA would move forward with approval when an advisory committee has given a recommendation to not move forward. So, Maya, this brings up a very important point around psychedelics in general, and just part of what I think has become a very, I would say, conventional discussion. It feels like I'm constantly just hearing or even talking to people about the role that psychedelics could play as part of treatment for some of the disorders that I discussed. But Maya, what exposure have you had in your professional or personal life to psychedelics?
Yeah, Kavita, I think it's such an interesting conversation. And just as you said, it's become so conventional. I'm hearing it more and more from patients that are coming in saying, oh, do you know someone who uses psychedelics as a part of their treatment modality? Actually trying to get referrals to providers because whatever, conventional pharmacology they're taking isn't eliciting the desired response that they're looking for. I know some of the patients that we work with have had long and very ongoing chronic depression that has a real impact on their quality of life, and it impacts how they interact with their families, get to work, all sorts of areas that someone who's not dealing with that may not think about. And people are seeking and they're searching. And the truth is, I have very few people that I would trust to refer my patients to for this psychedelic assisted treatment because A, it is so novel. And I'm careful to say this. I know that there are times where there are people who say that they know what they're doing and they don't have the experience. And in my estimation, shouldn't really be working with the psychedelics and patients. And so it's hard to say, well, where should people turn? Because so many folks are suffering. And I'm hopeful that in the coming decade and with research that's going on, that we'll have a credible place to send people who are interested in psychedelic assisted treatments. So Kavita, I'm interested, what about you? What are you seeing in your kind of work area?
So I will say that I will probably be labeled, you recall a former guest we had, Dave Asprey, where I think he succinctly pointed out just how much kind of conventional or Western doctors have failed patients. I would probably say that if Dave were sitting here listening to us talk, he would probably say the exact same thing around this topic. And I wouldn't challenge him that much. I do not find many of my colleagues who often come forward and say, here is a really important role for psychedelics in this treatment anxiety, post-traumatic stress. I worked in a VA where we were actually one of the clinical sites, not for the drug I mentioned, but for just exploring the role of psilocybin and other kind of psychedelics in post-traumatic stress disorder. And I vividly recall, Maya, that the team that was working on it, like it was always just kind of back of the break room kind of jokes, but people would say like, "Oh, those are the mushroom people." Like, "Oh, those are the folks tripping on acid that are trying to get the vets to do it." And there was part of me at the same time, like I would laugh and then I'd walk away and I'd be in the emergency room and we would see what was very clearly in like a textbook of post-traumatic stress disorder that was poorly treated. And at the time I was working in the VA, it was Operation Iraqi Freedom veterans that we were seeing. We had still had a stable kind of cohort of Vietnam veterans, but sadly we just got used to seeing so many Vietnam vets. But it became a very different proposition when I would see 26-year-olds showing up and had such severe PTSD that their lives were torn apart, which is what I think some of my colleagues saw decades earlier after the Vietnam War. So on one hand, we would make fun of the teams that were doing the very research that I think I've been trying to learn a lot about. I think that's why you and I wanted to do this topic for this podcast. But at the same time, there's an incredible stigma and it's treated as a fringe science. I will say that I think you and I have spoken about, like you and I read a lot, or we try to read a lot. And I think that there have now been prominent, including someone that we're going to talk to in this podcast, but prominent psychiatrists and psychologists that have really brought the science together, talked about like where there is a role for psychedelics. And I don't think that anybody could have an episode without mentioning The Body Keeps the Score and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. I'm going to not pronounce his name exactly accurately, but I will just say that the book, The Body Keeps the Score, or an abridged version of that, is probably a good staple. And I've encouraged my own colleagues to read it, those who have not, because it does explore some of these topics. And I think it's an important discussion. Maya, I think you've read, or at least we've talked about this book. Have you found anything else to be helpful in just educating yourself or educating your colleagues on this topic?
Well, there's some really interesting providers that I work with and someone that we're going to have on the show in the future. So I won't say his name today, but he has for a very long time worked with ketamine specifically around PTSD. And he also has been talking about this for decades. And what I have learned from my colleagues who actually do prescribe and work with psychedelics as a part of their treatment modality is that it is completely individualized. And we'll talk about this, but Kavita, one of my questions is, well, so if we're getting such great outcomes, how do we make this actually accessible to a wide variety of people and in a really safe way, right? So that comes to mind for me so often is like, yeah, what does the future look like? Especially because just as you said, we're seeing people younger and younger. And I have folks who come through the practice as young as 15 who are experiencing these unstable symptoms and they're in and out of psychiatric emergency departments. I mean, 15 is young, right? So I have hope for the future. I'm looking forward to our episode today, and I feel like this is going to scratch the surface and will be the beginning, but I really want to learn more because I think that there are some blind spots, just as you said, Kavita, where in the past I may have not taken it as seriously as I could have.
Yeah, that's why we're really excited to bring in Dr. Dave Rabin to speak to us, not just about this topic, but I think about his lifetime of training and pursuing what I would say has been an incredible challenge for any of us dealing with these diagnoses. So Dr. Dave Rabin has an MD and PhD from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, completed his medical training in psychiatry, and is a board-certified psychiatrist. We really look forward to speaking with him after this short break.
Hey, Well Now listeners, if you're enjoying the show and want to hear more, subscribe to our feed. New episodes come out every Wednesday morning. While you're there, check out our other episodes too, like last week's about how mold affects the air we breathe with indoor air specialist Michael Rubino. Check it out. Get 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new iPhone 15 or a pair of AirPods at Apple. You can choose to grow it at 4.4% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Subject to credit approval, savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings in Apple Card by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com. Spring is the best time to start a new workout routine. It's our yearly collective warm-up. I got my Peloton as a way to help me make it through the piles and piles of work that I was anticipating as I was working on my first cookbook. I knew that I would be in the kitchen for maybe 9 or 10 hours each day and that there was no hope that I would be able to go outside and run. Peloton to the rescue. That is when I started my cycling journey, and it quite literally saved me from feeling like I didn't have a way to move my body. This is the best time to get into a good rhythm, tap into your power, and build towards summer you. Peloton makes the process easier with personalized recommendations and guided programs that take the guesswork out of working out, so you can really jump right in, keeping your fitness journey fresh every day. Get a head start on summer with Peloton and choose a flexible payment plan that works for you at onepeloton.com/financing. Welcome back. You're listening to Well Now. I'm Maya Feller.
And I'm Kavita Patel. When we decided to tackle the important topic of psychedelics in healthcare, there were only a handful of names that we wanted to speak with. They all happened to start with Dave and ended with Rabin. So here we're very excited, Dr. Dave Rabin. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you both.
All right, great. So Dave, we start with a question standard to all our guests, and you can take it in whatever context you like. How do you define wellness?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I define wellness as balance more than anything, or just kind of like equanimity, but ease, right? Things are just kind of like flowing easily. There's evenness and balance. And I think I was influenced by a lot of, ancient health literature from Eastern and tribal practices that talk a lot about health as balance in their practices. And so and then also my study of the autonomic nervous system. So that's kind of where that comes from.
I have to say that I love that you started off with ease and balance, and then you brought in ancient wisdom and the autonomic nervous system. Well, I mean, we're not even 5 minutes in, and I'm like, all right, I'm going wherever you're going. I'm
That's
with
right.
you.
Awesome.
So, Dave, tell us a little bit about your journey into psychiatry and neuroscience. What really sparked your interest in this field?
Well, I think it started pretty young for me. I was, maybe between the ages of 4 and 7. And like many young boys and young children, I had very vivid dreams at night. And they weren't always nightmares or bad dreams. Sometimes they were great dreams, or they were just regular old, interactions with people like my siblings. But I did not realize that they were not dreams because I found myself referencing them in conversation with my brother or a friend who was present in the dream for me. And I eventually started to have more scary dreams. And so I went to my parents and I said, hey, what's going on when we're dreaming? Like, this is getting kind of weird. And they're like, oh, don't worry about that. It's not real. I'm like, well, what does that mean? And I'm like, they're like, well, real is this. Real is like the experience that we're having right now. It's real. It's our reality. And what happens in your dreams is not real. And I think what they were really trying to say is it can't hurt you in the same way that things can hurt you, like a car, right? In your dream is not going to hurt you the same way a car hitting you in real life would hurt you. And I think that's what they were trying to tell me, to make me not afraid of sleep, like most parents tell their kids. But as I kept having these dreams, I didn't have them very often, but as you keep having them and they seem so real as waking life, I think I did something that a lot of people don't do, which is I started to ask the question of, what does the word real really mean? And maybe the adults don't know, right? Maybe they don't realize that what's going on in here is actually real, and that we just need to look at it through a different lens. And so from a very, very young age, I started reading like sci-fi and becoming fascinated by consciousness and the mind and sort of the way we think and make meaning of the world. And then, of course, how that ultimately impacts the way we deal with stress and the way we grow from challenges and how we deal with illness. And so when psychedelic medicine came along, I was studying neuroscience. I mean, psychedelic medicine has been around for a long time, but it was not yet mainstream at this point. This is like 2012. And so I was studying neuroscience and psychiatry and mental health, but I really wasn't convinced that I was going to focus my life on treating mental illness and focusing on mental illness as my path, and clinical psychiatry as my path. And so I had a good friend who was in my medical training program who sent me 10 of the latest, most exciting publications in the psychedelic space associated with psychiatry. And I stayed up all night reading these papers, and I was blown away by the quality of the science and the way that these results were really starting to look like paradigm shifting results for the field of psychiatry. And like we could actually start to get to the root cause of what's going on underneath some of the layers of mental illness. And that was more exciting to me than anything, because I always love to solve hard problems and do like puzzles and challenges and things like that. So this was like the greatest challenge ever, was to really figure out how are psychedelics working to get these dramatic benefits in mental illness. And if we can figure it out, then maybe we can replicate it with other non-psychedelic tools like technology. And so that's kind of where I saw my path. And I went full force into psychiatry at that time and studying consciousness and psychedelics and mental health.
It seems like you were entering psychiatry. I'm not going to make any assumptions about age and time, but it feels like you were kind of really present and studying during that time when I don't think you and I could have found, I think maybe DSM-4, like one of the textbooks of psychiatry, and really have found a role at that time for psychedelic assisted therapy. The trials were ongoing, or peer review studies had just come out. And yet here you are, like, I think we're now at a moment where what might have felt very unconventional, Dave, now feels like I've got people who don't even know I'm a doctor, talking to me about kind of the role of potentially like psilocybin, or, have you been seeing like kind of where there could be, some potential for MDMA and PTSD. So you really were not just at that inflection point, but you've continued to be, I think, an advocate for thinking about the role of psychedelic assisted therapy. Can you just describe like how psychedelics are being used in therapy, and then who are like the patients for which this is, in your mind, like when you think about this, like who should we be bringing this forward to? Who are the ideal patients for this and the benefits of it?
So I think, just to start off, the only legal psychedelic medicine that is available today is ketamine.
Right.
All other psychedelic medicines are not actually federally legal to be delivered by a hospital or clinician. So that means that whether it's, generally speaking, even in legal states, cannabis is federally illegal, MDMA, psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca, almost all of it is federally illegal and can't be administered to you by a licensed clinician. So that's a really important distinguishing factor that most people overlook, because a licensed clinician has a board and has overseeing bodies that regulate how they practice. And even though people still mess up and make mistakes, there are consequences. And in decriminalized states, or in states where this is not federally legal, which is for all of those drugs I just mentioned, cannabis, MDMA, psilocybin, other plant medicines, LSD, et cetera, whenever you're getting those administered, in general, you're getting them from an unlicensed clinician, or somebody who's not a clinician at all but claims to be, or is not a shaman but claims to be. And who knows how much experience this person has, right? It's really hard to tell. And so the lack of effective legislation and legalization around the way that we use and think about these medicines creates effectively like an abstinence-only education situation we have for sex, but for drugs. And now people are, accidentally misusing and abusing drugs because they're seeking healing, because the current system is like, I still don't think that there's any psychedelic medicine in the DSM to date. I still don't think it's there. I think that what is there is ketamine for, maybe for depression. I don't even know if that made it in yet. And so the field is way behind. And a lot of people are seeking psychedelic drugs because of the hope and promise that's being talked about. But then there isn't an actual legal framework that's safe for people to achieve them. And safety is the most important single criteria for being able to get healing outcomes from psychedelic medicine. And that's what the whole therapy is really all about. So ketamine is the only legal medicine. But the way they generally work is they amplify awareness. So awareness is this thing, like right now we're all aware of each other, right? Because we're having a conversation that requires a lot of attention. But in general, our awareness has so much more to it, like everything that's going on and happening in our bodies and around our bodies while we're just thinking about this conversation, which is a million billion things, right? And our heart's pumping and our lungs are breathing and our, skin is doing its thing and ignoring the feeling of the clothes on our bodies, right? And like all these different things are happening. We're digesting our food. And so we can at any time be made aware of that information that's stored in what Freud and Carl Jung called like the subconscious or the unconscious content of our lives, which is, guess what comes up in dreams, the very first psychedelic state that any of us have, going full circle.
I had to pause for a second because as you were speaking, I was having an internal discussion like, wow, well, this is mind blowing, because you're right. For so many of us in our lives, we actually put our dreams aside and separate ourselves from that dream state, when I feel like what I'm hearing from you is that there's a lot of value in that. And I know just from a nutrition perspective, we actually talk about sleep as being a rejuvenating moment for folks and like something that none of us get enough of. But it seems, Dave, like dreams and that state is also quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where all of our memory reconsolidation happens in dreams. Which is typically what we call REM sleep. So it's where the most important short-term memories that we formed during that past whatever amount of time when we were awake gets transitioned and filtered and transitioned and stored in long-term memory and organized properly, right? Because it has to fit into the history of all the things that it was related to and not be connected to things it wasn't related to. So that's what's called memory consolidation. And that's what happens when we dream and in REM sleep. And that is where we get all of our like emotional and cognitive mental rest and recovery. And then deep sleep is where we get all of our physical rest and recovery throughout the day. So that's why it's so important and why we don't function properly when we don't get good sleep.
Mm-hmm. So, Dave, I know that you're engaged in quite a bit of research and study. And right now, I'd love to hear you tell our listeners a little bit about the epigenetic study that you're conducting with MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and the nonprofit Modern Spirit. Tell us a little bit about that research and what some of the expected outcomes are going to be.
So that study is actually published, which is really exciting. We published it in February of last year. And the origins of this work were to try to understand, as I mentioned earlier, if we're seeing, I don't know how much of your audience is familiar with the results from some of the psychedelic clinical trials, but what's so amazing about these results is that 1 to 3 doses of the medicine, in the case of ketamine, it's more, it's because ketamine is shorter acting, but maybe it's 12 doses. But the point is 1 to 12 doses of psychedelic medicine spread out over 12 to 20 weeks can take somebody with an over 50% likelihood of success, which is way better than what we're seeing with antidepressants and other treatments. I would say for MDMA, it seems like 70 to 88%, ketamine, something like 60 to 80%, meaning of people who have like severe mental illness coming in and having, like, to answer your question earlier, who's a good candidate? People with the PTSD and depression in particular are top candidates. Other mental illnesses, we have to do a little bit of therapy work in preparation. Schizophrenia, bipolar, absolutely not. Personality disorder, absolutely not. Active drug abusing people, absolutely not. But everyone else, for the most part, depression and PTSD are all great candidates. And so the way that the medicine works is that it helps them to feel safe enough in their bodies to be able to observe the trauma that has been stored in their bodies. Trauma being the way our body responds to very intense, meaningful, challenging experiences that we interpreted at whatever time it was that they happened as threat, and that we didn't have support for after.
Dave, that makes me think about like the current pharmacology that is being prescribed. What is that pharmacology getting versus missing? Meaning, like, how is it actually impacting the person, and where's their space that it's not impacting?
I love this question. So the way that the current drugs work is that they're stabilizer drugs, right? So think about the model that we use for an ER for treating acute illness. We're applying to chronic mental illness, but we don't have an actual solution to the problem. So in the case of SSR, in the case of most psychiatric drugs, they either, like amphetamines, Adderall, Ritalin, Wellbutrin, they turn you up. They help increase your focus so you can focus away from stress, from distressing thoughts. Then there's all the sedative hypnotic drugs, the benzodiazepines, the barbiturates, the the Ambien, the other things that are very sedating. Those all numb you to emotion. Generally speaking, they just decrease awareness. They're dulling. They work kind of like alcohol. So they just decrease your overall sensation on the whole, and then you're less sensitive to things in your environment, which is why a lot of people who take those drugs often resemble people who are drunk in behavior and functionality. So then there's the middle class, which is like SSRI antidepressants. So these medications work by shrinking the emotional window. So the serotonin receptor is really, there's many of them, but the one we're talking about here is called the 5-HT2A receptor in particular. And it's responsible for, it seems, meaning making in a lot of ways. And that it requires burst activation to make meaning. That could be positive meaning and awareness of positive things that you make meaning from, or it could be negative. But the point is, it requires a burst of activation at that receptor site to have those meaning shifting, meaning making effects. When you overwhelm the receptors and you saturate them, what happens is the receptors get overstimulated. And this is what happens with SSRI antidepressants. This is how they work, is they block the reuptake of serotonin. So here's the cell that's like releasing serotonin, and it's like bloop, 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 pumping out serotonin, right? And then it's pulling the serotonin back in every time it pumps it out. But now you take an SSRI, it like binds this thing and it says, you're not going to pull it back in. You're just going to keep putting it out. So now there's an SSRI on board, and you got this neuron pumping out serotonin, and then you have the receiving neuron, and the receiving neuron sucking that serotonin up. And then now there's like a flood of serotonin in here. So the receptors that are receiving serotonin on the receiving neuron say, I'm overwhelmed, overstimulated. I need to go hide. And so they literally withdraw back and decrease their sensitivity to serotonin. At the receptor site, that seems to be really, really important for meaning making. Now, what is the single most common side effect of people who take SSRIs long term? Dullness, numbness, apathy, loss of meaning in their lives. So there's really like a neurochemical relationship between how these medicines work and what they actually do to us, which is so interesting. The point is, they're all stabilizing medications. They work really, really well in the short term. They work really, really poorly long term, because it would be like you coming into the ER with a broken leg, and the doctor's like, "Oh, you're in a lot of pain. You have a broken leg. Take these pain pills." Right. And then he's like, "Well, we can't fix that right now because you don't have enough money and there's not enough time or doctor's on. So why don't you just go home and hang out with that broken leg and this bottle of pain pills?" And then months go by and years go by, and you still have a broken leg that never quite healed properly or works right now. And it has all these scars, and you're addicted to pain pills. So that's basically what we're currently doing with the way we prescribe for chronic use every major mental health medication, especially when we don't include therapy, which is required. So psychedelic medicines like break that trend by creating these massive burst activation experiences at the serotonin receptor that activate that receptor for an extended period of time, but just for like 6 hours. And in that 6-hour period, it seems we're dramatically increasing the learning capacity of the brain, the neuroplasticity of the brain to form new connections. around the way we actually want to think about ourselves from a perspective of safety. And so the safety is actually like reprogramming the fear learning that's accelerated by the molecular action of the psychedelic drug. And that's why its mechanism is so freaking cool and unique and just game-changing for the field.
I mean, it sounds like we need a lot more discussions like this, a lot more research. But in the meantime, we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we'll hear more from Dr. Dave Rabin on psychedelics in healthcare.
This episode is brought to you by Puree. I first started using Puree's PW1 whey protein powder in vanilla as part of my morning routine just to get a little more nutrition. And then I started adding in the chocolate in the afternoon or early evening, a little bit like a dessert delight, but also to just try to make sure that I'm keeping a healthy, balanced diet. And I was shocked that I didn't feel that grittiness that I get with other protein powders. It was super easy to blend. And it tasted great. With Puree, every batch is third-party tested against more than 200 contaminants, with all results published online. So you can have peace of mind. No need to worry about hidden or harmful ingredients. Take the next step to support your health with Puree. Puree is offering this amazing deal just for Well Now listeners. 20% off site-wide. Just go to our special URL, puree.com/wellnow, and use our promo code WellNow. This even applies to the already discounted subscriptions. You'll get almost a third off the price. Go to PUORI.com/wellnow. Don't wait. Use promo code WellNow at puree.com/wellnow.
Well, it looks like we just crossed 5 million podcasts in the world, so it is with some humility that I introduce mine, Kelly Corrigan Wonders. Once a week, we share heart-to-hearts with smart, good people like Brian Stevenson, Anna Quinlan, Father Greg Boyle, talking about how we treat each other, how we treat ourselves, and how we might do both better. Kelly Corrigan Wonders is a podcast for people who like to laugh while they think and aren't afraid of feelings. Join us for Kelly Corrigan Wonders.
You're listening to Well Now from Slate. I'm Maya Feller.
And I'm Kavita Patel. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Dave Rabin. Dave, I love how much kind of vivid imagery you offer when we're trying to describe. I don't think someone has taken a peer-reviewed study and offered like such depth and hope to it. But let's kind of take that through to what I would suggest is a setback in the field. And you can disagree with me, but there was a recent advisory committee meeting that you well are aware of for the Food and Drug Administration. And we don't know what the final action of the FDA is at the time of this recording, but it seems like it would be difficult for the FDA to go against the recommendation of the advisory committee, which was against a bit of a double negative, against the approval of the therapeutic for PTSD, midomethamphetamine, or MDMA. And I heard, as probably you did, some of the incredible public comment during the open comment period. Veterans rights groups, patient advocacy groups, providers, physicians, all kind of groups who basically said a little bit of kind of a piece of what you just described in your recent study and what kind of promise that MDMA could hold, particularly for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. First, Dave, just your reactions to what you kind of heard in that advisory committee meeting, and then tell us about what the future holds. If you're somebody with a diagnosis of PTSD, you were really hoping and thinking about this therapeutic, the studies that were obtained to get to that point, and kind of what I describe as a setback. But what do you do if you're one of the patients that have this diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a really heartbreaking and challenging situation for the field, more so for patients and veterans than for anyone. Because there was so much hope that was around these treatments working, because from the data that I was describing to you and the data from my colleagues' studies and the data from our studies, we're seeing that MDMA-assisted therapy is effectively, if if the published results are true and consistent with what was actually discovered in the study, which is these, which we don't have any reason to believe that's not the case right now, which is that MDMA-assisted therapy appears to be, through amplifying the molecular pathways of safety in the brain, helping to not only clinically induce symptom remission that is dramatic in people in the short term, but also it perpetuates into the long term for at least a year after the treatment has been stopped, with just 3 doses and 42 hours of psychotherapy over 12 weeks. And that experience patients are having is not just shifting how they score on depression and PTSD scales that are clinically validated, but it's also, in our study, the epigenetic study, has also shown that the more people get better from MDMA-assisted therapy, the more repair of their cortisol receptor functioning they have. And that cortisol receptor in particular is implicated in trauma, and that it gets damaged epigenetically by trauma. So this is really needs to be taken into consideration, given that over 70% of veterans who are currently getting treatment with the treatments available, the gold standard treatments, are not getting better long-term. And they have twice as high a suicide rate as everybody else. So that's the playing field that we're in right now, right? And so I think it goes without saying that the FDA advisory committee that was composed of only one person from the FDA, one or two people from pharma, and then a bunch of academic clinicians who I don't think are particularly familiar with the background and what the history of MDMA with the FDA is. Maybe they are, but they focused on, it was very surprising that they gave that opinion that they gave. And it was an opinion, right? It's an opinion. It's like you asking me my opinion. And I think that was even if it is correct, even if they're right, it was the opinion and the vote were issued without taking into account the sensitivity of the matter, right? And I think that this is really hurtful to a lot of people, and patients are really struggling right now, and they're losing faith in the medical system. And that's the last thing we want them to do. The medical system is our last bastion of hope, where people will still believe, because so many of us care, that we're actually trying to help and heal them and the world, right? And without that structure, a lot of our society doesn't really have a backbone to stand on. So that trust is really important. And I don't think they were really considering that when they were, releasing the outcomes of their vote.
So Dave, where's the hesitancy? Because I'm sitting here listening, both Kavita and I work with patients, and we know the mental health crisis that's happening in this country across all ages, right? There's no contesting it, right? So where's the hesitancy in adopting this as part of the treatment protocol that could have really beneficial outcomes? And as you said, really kind of reinstill faith, in the medical system, but also help people to simply live better lives?
It's a good question. I don't think we know the entire answer yet in all of its detail, but what the committee has said is that there are concerns that have not been fully disclosed to the public yet about the level of rigor in terms of certain ways that the clinical trial was conducted. And, this is a 38-year project that MAPS and Rick Doblin have been working on. MAPS, now Lykos. But they've been working on this for 38 years. So they put a lot of time and thought into this. And I'm sure that they made mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes doing anything, let alone running FDA trials, which are incredibly challenging. And they did it as a nonprofit, so it's a daunting task. But the committee brought up that there were certain things that they believe could make it challenging to interpret the results. And so I think now what this is really calling for is a full review by the FDA to actually make sure that the results, that the results are the results. Because if the results are the results, as far as I'm concerned, it goes without saying, this is not an if situation. This needs to be a when situation. And if more information needs to be put forward to determine is this actually healing people or is it hurting people? And if it's hurting people, are those risks we can mitigate? And if we can't mitigate them, then we need to do another trial to show we can. And so we have to think about this as a when problem. And the FDA might say that they think that the benefits outweigh the risks after doing a full review, and we can only hope, right? That being said, they often take the advice of the advisory committee. So I hope they don't. I hope they do their full own review and actually look at the results and understand the impact this has for patients in the community and how much it means to the community to be able to have tools that are new and that work. Like our SSRIs like Paxil and Zoloft are our only 2 FDA cleared drugs for PTSD. And we've had them for 25 years without a new one. So, again, I think this is going to be a when problem, not an if problem, but we just need to focus on educating everybody so that people understand what this means. And, and the government needs to be educated, right? People need to understand, what this really means in the community and how these treatments work. And they're not like 70s rave party drugs. This is medicine. And that's what we're talking about.
Dave Rabin is a psychiatrist who specializes in treatment-resistant mental health disorders. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's our show this week. Well Now is produced by Vic Whitley-Berry with help from Christy Tyro Macanjola. Ben Richmond is Slate's Senior Director of Podcast Operations. Alicia Montgomery is Vice President of Audio.
We'd love to hear from you. Email us at wellnow@slate.com. If you want to listen to this show ad-free, as well as hear bonus material from other Slate podcasts, consider joining Slate Plus. Your contribution makes the work we do on this show possible. Find out how you can support our work at slate.com/wellnowplus. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday as we tackle another part of the wellness industry. I'm Kavita Patel.
And I'm Maya Feller. Thanks for listening.
Spring is the best time to start a new workout routine. It's our yearly collective warm-up. Peloton has a variety of classes and links to choose from. Even if you only have 5 minutes, Peloton has classes for you, from guided hikes, Pilates, to high-intensity rides. Anything and everything you need to get where you're going. Get a head start on summer with Peloton and choose a flexible payment plan that works for you at onepeloton.com/financing.